This is Omnivore presents SciDish, a podcast from the Institute of Food Technologists. In each episode, we take a deeper dive into a single topic shaping the future of food. Hosted by the editors of Food Technology, together with IFT members and subject matter experts, SciDish brings you the science, insights, and real-world perspectives that drive innovation, solve complex challenges, and connect disciplines across the global food system. Thanks for joining us. Let's get into the conversation.
This episode of Omnivore Presents SciDish is sponsored by Almond Board of California and RTI International.
I'm Kelly Hensel, Deputy Managing Editor of Food Technology Magazine. And in this episode of SciDish, we're exploring what it really takes to move from waste to worth and how circular thinking could reshape the future of our food system. To dig into what that looks like in action, I'm joined by two experts working at the intersection of science, innovation, and system design. Amy Rydeen is an innovation advisor at RTI International, where she translates complex scientific research into strategic insights to help nonprofit, corporate, and government organizations advance global sustainability and health outcomes. Her work has supported upcycling and waste reduction initiatives across multiple food value chains. Lara Ramdin is a scientist and innovation leader specializing in upcycled foods and circular product design. She has held senior R&D and innovation roles at companies including Unilever, Estée Lauder, Molson Coors, and Dole Sunshine, and currently serves on the Upcycled Food Foundation board, where she helps advance research and scientific standards for upcycling. Together, we'll explore how technologies like AI and biotechnology are opening new pathways for waste valorization, why so many promising ideas stall before scale, and what it will take from cross-industry collaboration to a fundamental mindset shift to build truly climate-resilient food systems. Let's get into the conversation. From where each of you sits, what does circularity actually look like in practice in today's food industry? And, why is it becoming so urgent?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because I think circularity is this aspirational vision, right, that we're all striving towards. But that doesn't mean there's not examples already implemented today that we can highlight. And at RTI, we've seen examples of circularity all across the food system, from the level of food manufacturing at the commercial scale. A recent example is from the Wonderful Company, who have upcycled their pomegranate brines into an antioxidant extract, which is really cool. We also see circularity at a more community or sort of local level as well. So we've done work in Western North Carolina, where we've seen examples of the microbreweries sharing their spent brewer's yeast with the livestock industry that's also in place in that region to use as animal feed.
Lara, what does it look like from your perspective?
Well, I think the word circularity is already becoming rife for greenwashing in a way, because I see it used in many different circumstances and not always, and it's certainly not always used the same way. I think there's a tendency to believe that capturing the waste of something and doing something that waste means circularity. And actually, that's only one part of circularity. Circularity actually starts it doesn't start in the bin. It starts right at the beginning of how you design a system and how you design the food system. So that is how we measure loss, how we predict deterioration, how we design packaging. How we manage the side streams is certainly important, but how we decide what deserves to stay in the food system. Ultimately, when I think about circularity in food, I think, how do we keep the nutrients, the value, and the functionality in the food system for longer? So I think that we have an opportunity to put our arms around that term, by the way, and protect it and actually make it something more meaningful and specific, as opposed to it sort of being used in multiple different circumstances, not always correctly.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point about the tendency to greenwash the term. And I especially love your point about not just thinking about it as to what we do with things that are already in the system, but how we design that system from the start is such a good reminder. from a whole systems perspective, obviously. So and Lara, just to stick with you for a minute, in your recent food technology column that you wrote, you described food waste reduction evolving to kind of a more engineered system that includes like better measurement, prediction, upgrading of side streams. So what technologies or approaches are helping shift waste from a disposal problem into that resource opportunity that you're getting to?
Well, I mean, I hate to say the dreaded A word, but certainly AI. But I think I actually think that AI is a really valuable tool used in the right way. And there's no doubt that using AI in terms of predictive modeling, I think if I go back to circularity and I think about design and I think about keeping nutrients in the food system for longer, then AI and predictive modeling helps you design that food system differently. I see this emergence of digital twins, whereby you can create the sort of digital footprint of your manufacturing alongside your manufacturing and look at your losses in real time and make modulations in that process via your digital twin in real time. That's certainly a totally new approach. That's something that's very new. I think it's only really, I don't know if any manufacturers are actually using it, but there are certainly lots of papers being written about that kind of technology. If I talk about circularity and I talk about what happens with the consumer and the retailer, because that's still where we see the most significant amount of waste. I think AI is also helping food designers have a better handle on shelf life.
I think the biotech, bioinnovation space is just at a super interesting inflection point with AI. In the past, we used to have to sort of find an enzyme in nature's repertoire, sort of make small tweaks to it and maybe be a little bit better at doing the chemical conversion we'd like. But now with AI and de novo protein design, we can basically say if we want to convert, this waste stream into this higher value chemical, like design us an enzyme cascade to do so. And I think because food waste is biological in nature, the biological technology suite, as it's coming up the curve and becoming way more powerful with AI, I think we're going to see a lot of interesting innovation in that space.
Amy, I wanted to ask you, when organizations look at turning food waste and the streams from food waste into higher value ingredients, kind of what determines that, whether that opportunity is technically feasible and commercially viable? Because we can't forget about, whether it is feasible, but is there a market for it? Is it, that key point of commercially viable?
Yeah, for sure. So I would reinforce the establishing a market demand is so important. Oftentimes the technologies it takes to take that waste stream and convert it into valuable upcycled products will take time, maybe 2-3 years, 5 years down the road. So not only is there a market demand for what you're producing now, but is it sustained and will it grow over that timeline? And there's a lot to do with sort of volume matching too. Is there room in that market for your product, or is it already well served today? Can you create the necessary volumes to meet the needs of that market? Or can the market, absorb the amount of product you're taking? So one way we've seen companies sort of reconcile that market is oftentimes they look for internal pathways to upcycle. So how do they take their waste, bring it into something valuable that they can then plug back into their own manufacturing processes? I think another important factor is thinking about sort of strategic business fit and brand fit. A lot of times waste streams can be upcycled into many different products that might not have a natural home in the company's product portfolio. We've done a lot of work on acid whey, and in theory, you could upcycle that into so many different markets, specialty chemicals, fuels, biosurfactants. And a lot of times that's a big pivot for the companies who are producing that waste stream. So making sure that there's a natural sort of home for it as well. Yeah, those are a few examples.
Yeah, and Lara, what does that look from your perspective? Because I know you obviously have some experience with this.
I So I think one of the biggest challenges is security of supply and consistency of that material. And I think there have been many advances made in the processing of waste streams and byproducts in particular. So when I first started this journey, I think there were, very one or two very standard methods of the way in which you would treat some of these materials. And I think there have been significant advances made, particularly in supercritical fluid extraction or ultrasonic processing, and just to name it, and pulse electric fields. And I think not only are they more efficient, and so they give you a different yield, but they also ensure that the quality and the consistency of the material is more consistent. I think if you are someone who is looking to use a valuable ingredient that comes from a waste stream or a byproduct, one of your biggest concerns is that you're always going to have that supply. Yeah. And Amy's right, the demand needs to be there, because I've worked on that side and trying to sort of talk to food product developers and say, you've got this great flour, and they're like, yeah, that's great, and sort of logically that seems interesting, but also over here I don't really need it. That's a really difficult conversation, because I've been in those conversations. That's a difficult conversation to have, right? I do think that because of the volatility in some key raw materials, cocoa is one, for example, and then and it will happen to others. What's happening to cocoa will happen to others. I think there will be a necessity whereby people who use those materials, food designers, food manufacturers, will be looking for other sources that can replace or can work with. So they're not saying replace completely. You're not going to take your cocoa out of your cookie or your chocolate, but actually you might want to replace some of it with something else that could act like that. I think we're going to see much, much more of that. So I think processing technology, advances, yield, and also consistency of the quality of the ingredient are all helping.
In talking about having these tough conversations with companies, and as manufacturers are exploring upcycling opportunities, Amy, I wanted to ask you, I know you've had some of those conversations. What are some technical or operational hurdles that they tend to underestimate when they're thinking about this early on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So from the point of view of a company looking to upcycle a waste stream, it's usually pretty obvious what the problematic waste stream is, right? They're paying to offload it, it's produced in large volumes, and I think there's usually collective buy-in that something has to be done. But what we've seen underestimate is the time and the resources it takes to determine what you're going to produce from that waste stream. So because we can use chemical processes, physical processes like the ones Laura has described, and then biological processes, which I'm really excited about, enzymatic transformations, fermentations, the amount of options you have available to you to transform a waste into is actually quite vast. And it can take a lot of time to sort of narrow that option set into the ones that are have the most potential. And we see that it takes really a structured sort of semi-quantitative approach with specific tools like techno-economic analyses to sort of whittle down your option set. And we do see that the amount of time and resources it takes to sort of walk through that process, create really clear decision criteria, what makes the cut, what doesn't, get all the folks to the table and have those conversations, can take a lot of resources and a lot of time. And it's a big technical challenge.
We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
RTI International, an independent scientific research institute dedicated to improving the human condition, is pleased to sponsor this episode of Omnivore Presents SciDish. As consumer and regulatory pressures rises, food, beverage, and agriculture companies need actionable, science-based insights to make high-stakes decisions. By combining social, statistical, and laboratory sciences and engineering, RTI International helps organizations across the supply chain identify shifts early and turn complex challenges into competitive advantage. Discover more at rti.org/food-innovation.
And a lot of these innovations obviously look very promising in pilot projects or, in small scales, but scaling them across the real supply chains, and we've already talked about that, making sure there is the material there and enough of it and the demand. But Amy, sticking with you for a second, from your perspective advising organizations, what separates ideas that successfully scale from those that stall out early?
Yeah, it sort of reinforces some of the elements Laura was speaking to, like access to the feedstock and the quality of the waste feedstock that you're going to use is a big issue. One thing that we see gets overlooked is that because it's circular, right? Because we want to keep nutrients in the system. If there's contamination in that waste stream, whether that's microplastics or forever chemicals, that can be a big barrier up front because then you're perpetuating, right, that contamination across the food system. So that's a big issue as well. And sometimes the waste stocks can just be really challenging and technically hard to work with. So acid whey is a big one where it has a very low pH, high oxygen demand, and it can make it really hard to dry and to process. It can lead to equipment fouling. And then to the point around what you're producing, there's a lot of steps that can go into sort of downstream processing of your end product to make sure it meets quality, purity, and performance standards of the end market that you've chosen. So that can be an issue as well. And a lot of when we've seen these projects take hold in companies, they start in an R&D function, right? They're an innovation idea, but to take it from that bench scale research, like the preliminary analytics, to a full-blown innovation project happening at scale, it requires coordination between the R&D teams and then the plant operators and the other side of the business who does full-scale, manufacturing. And that collaboration and the coordination across those stakeholders can also be a barrier to scale.
Yeah. And that makes me think about, obviously collaboration within their team, but also, thinking about collaborations, partnerships across and the industry in general. And so, Lara, I'm wondering, from a circular food systems perspective, what kinds of those partnerships across the supply chains or across sectors are needed to make those solutions work at scale?
I do think that we've been thinking about this all wrong, as in we're trying to sort of fit. And again, I realize this is just my my personal opinion, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And I think we've been over the years, and we're trying to retrograde fit something over here into a system that's very well established, costs millions of dollars, and would take years and millions of dollars to change.
Yeah.
And I do think this is where collaboration is key. And I do think that it almost needs a completely different way of looking at it. And what I mean by that is you almost need someone that's not in food manufacturing to look at this system and to say, and I'm sure you see this too in your job, Amy, because you probably work with multiple different clients. Like, what if someone who worked in fashion, textile upcycling came to a food manufacturing? Essentially, they're an engineer, of course, right? And looked at this and said, okay, how would I do this differently? It wouldn't be a transformation of the system as a whole. I think it probably would be a sort of add-on. And I do believe, and I keep saying this to people, and I don't know whether anybody listens to me, but I'll keep saying it. I think that anything that we do from an upcycling and waste management perspective has to be modular, and it has to, and I think that's where an alternative point of view and collaboration across different industries could make a difference. Yeah. And I think that we need to look outside of the food industry and say, how are they upcycling in fashion? How are they upcycling in household goods? How are they upcycling in all the other industries? Because it is going on, right? Mm-hmm. It's going on in multiple different places. And how are they making that work? How are they making that work in their manufacturing? And how can we adapt that? And how do we do it in such a way that we don't need to re-engineer the whole system? Yeah. How can it be modular? How can it clip on to, I clip on, I'm oversimplifying, obviously, to this system over here and this system over here. I think that's the kind of collaboration that we need in order to experience this sort of revolution that we're looking for. I see us experiencing incremental incremental evolutions here and there. And actually what we really need is a sort of engineering, manufacturing, operational revolution.
We'll be back with more Omnivore in a moment. But first, this word from our sponsor.
With consumers growing concerned with gut health and clean label, the 2026 Innova Trends shows almonds are an ideal ingredient for innovation. Their fiber and bioactives can help support digestive wellness, and their naturalness makes them an ingredient people trust. Not only that, but almonds have taste, texture, and aromatic qualities which create a sensory eating experience. Learn more at almonds.org/trends.
Amy, where do you see kind of the biggest opportunities for that collaboration, whether it's between companies and governments or different kinds of industries, just kind of accelerate all of this?
Well, first of all, yeah, RTI, we do work across all levels of the food system, from upstream agricultural producers to the ingredient suppliers to food manufacturers, regulatory health agencies, and like everywhere in between. So from that vantage point, we do see a big opportunity to take like a systems science perspective to this and sort of implement, not studying upcycling in sort of these siloed pieces of the food chain, but really looking at it from that big picture point of view that Laura's alluding to too, and thinking about transformational systems change. So for example, like we have so many different levers we can pull to upcycle, but it's not always clear like where those levers generate net benefits for the whole system and like what the unintended consequences are of those changes at some point in the value chain across the whole system. So I'll give you an example. If we want to extend the shelf life of food in fresh food in the value chain, we could add packaging, but then that packaging becomes waste in and of itself. So from a climate or GHG emission standpoint, like which is better?
Right.
And there's so many different permutations of that, but sort of conducting analyses at a cost benefit analysis across the entire food chain is definitely an opportunity. Otherwise, we sort of end up in this situation where individual actors are sort of operating by their own incentives, and we sort of miss the opportunity to consider like where are the trade-offs and the co-benefits, and how do we drive towards circularity across the entire system and like really coordinate and collaborate across all the different pieces to figure out like what are the best solutions and how do we study them from that entire systems perspective.
How can companies successfully bring these ingredients, these circular ingredients or products or upcycled things to market in terms of like, communicating that value to consumers, but also ensuring that they do deliver on the nutrition and the taste and the functionality that everybody is expecting? That's hard, I would imagine.
It is very hard. And let's be honest, nothing gets bought if it doesn't taste good, right? And that's regardless of whether it includes an upcycled ingredient or it's an upcycled product. That's the golden rule. Taste is king or queen, depending on your, right? And then, and so I think that is where, I think honestly, that's where generally, if you're trying to make a quote unquote sustainable product, I think that is generally where people have struggled to try and marry, that idea of it being, green or sustainably sourced or upcycled, whatever it is, with, consumers' expectations. Yeah. As a food industry, we've taught people that certain foods, especially if you look at the upcycled product market, I guess the biggest category where we see most activity is in snacks, and baked goods, and the food industry has taught consumers what to expect from those kinds of products, right? So, and rightly, they don't necessarily expect less necessarily, or there's a small subsection of people that don't mind compromising, but it is small, right? The average person doesn't compromise on taste and indulgence and experience of a snack. In the upcycled world, we have evolved the way in which we talk about using materials from waste, right? I think when upcycling first started 6-7 years ago, the upcycle community leaned really hard into saying that these products were made from materials that came from waste and they were upcycling. First of all, upcycling wasn't really that much in people's consciousness then.
Right.
And secondly, you know, there is a huge disgust factor. That's what they call it in sensory biology, isn't it? You know, when somebody was like, oh, it's a product from waste.
Waste,
And so
right.
actually we've moved away from such overt signaling and more to do, and we're leaning much more into we've made use of the whole plant, or you know, we've made use of all the material, or you know, much more into this kind of common sense, making the best use of everything, you know, stretching everything, this idea that you would stretch everything to make it go further, that's actually becoming much more palatable in terms of signaling to the consumer.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's I was going to say the consumer is very used to that in their own lives right now, stretching everything to,
Right.
you
Right.
know, so that
So
resonates.
it makes total sense that
Yeah.
you would make something from, we
Right.
don't want to say leftovers, but it
Right.
does make total sense that you would make something go further because it's a valuable resource. And
Right.
we want to, yeah, that
Yeah.
resonates with people because of what they're doing in their own lives.
Yeah, very, very true. Interesting. So I want to, looking to the future, whether that's a year from now, 5 years from now, I'm wondering, Amy, if you can, I'd love to ask you this question. For product developers who are listening to this podcast, what's a practical step that they could take to start integrating, even if it's a really small step, circular principles into their innovation strategy? I know that's not talking big system change, but it has to, we have to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, no, I love this question. Definitely challenging. I think what I'll do is sort of take it back to sort of where we started this conversation with circularity begins with the design, right? It's that upfront, building it into the system from the beginning. So one thing that comes to mind for me is you could start by sort of taking an assessment or taking stock of your current processes, your current manufacturing systems, and finding those opportunities where you can be more efficient or minimize waste to begin with, right? And in corporate innovation, we see a lot of innovation strategies that sort of start in their horizon one around maintaining market leadership in their core business, their core portfolio, right? Defending the products that they do really well today. But we also see is those products oftentimes have been manufactured the same way for many, many, many years. And it's just kind of, we do it because we've always done it that way. So I think those are really great opportunities to look at how things are run today and to find places where you can streamline, be more efficient, minimize waste. And that will not only offer an attractive ROI and cost savings for the business, but also fixing those align really well with sustainability goals as well. So it's a win-win from my perspective.
And Lara, you can answer that question too, but I also want to ask you, if and you've kind of touched on this, I think, but if the industry is serious about building this climate resilient food systems, there's obviously a mind shift that needs to happen. What is that? What is that mind shift that needs to happen that hasn't yet occurred?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we talk a lot about climate resilient food systems, but yet we still operate with the same practices where we're using raw materials in our food systems that are grown the same way and use the same amount of water and use the same amount of energy. And we know where to buy them from. They're consistent. They do what we expect them to, and they behave the way we expect them to in food systems. So the mind shift for everybody in the food system is radical. Like that's radical. And there's a small group of people who've said, well, actually, I know that goes on in food systems, but I feel like there's all this value over here that needs to be captured, right? And they've been trucking along for the last 6 or 7 years in the upcycled world to try and make a difference. I do see the pendulum swinging a little bit the other way, and I think that's come out of necessity, right? Supply chain volatility, climate change affecting the way in which crops are growing.
Yeah.
At some point, the thing that I hope is that we're doing that before we get to the tipping point where, water scarcity I don't want to be looking at water scarcity when it's here right in front of my face, right? As a food product designer, I want to be planning in for water scarcity that may happen in X number of years. Well, it's already here in some places, but may happen, in X number of years. I want to be designing for that. I hope I want to be, predicting that and designing around that. So I think that I always hope that we are shifting the food system to accommodate what we see already happening. But I think it's happening much slower than I expected, to be honest. So climate resilient food systems means that we've looked at the way in which we grow things and water scarcity. We're also looking at the way in which we capture energy and use energy. I mean, energy is we want to talk about circularity in energy. That's a whole separate conversation, but worthy, and also a lot of learnings there that could be applied to food systems. And then, we also have to accept that not all crops grow the way they have historically. Yeah. And so there are lots of people who are working on different ways to grow crops in different climate environments and looking for so that we can grow food, right? I mean, ultimately, the reason why we're here is because we want to feed people. Mm-hmm. So if you think about that and you think about that modeling and you think about how we're going to feed people, I don't want to get all apocalyptic and, dystopian, but, I do think about that sometimes. So, yeah, I think the mind shift is radical. It's been happening incrementally over the years. I think there will be, the cocoa shortage, supply chain volatility is a good example of what has forced people who use that material, has forced them to do in terms of their product design. My question to them is, why aren't we doing that across the board? Because climate change means that all these other crops and other materials that you use will be affected. And so why doesn't that revolutionize the way we do food product design per se, full stop?
It's a great question. I want to thank you both for a fascinating conversation. I could keep having this conversation for at least another hour, but we've run out of time.
Thanks again to Almond Board of California and RTI International for sponsoring this episode of Omnivore Presents SciDish. Visit Almond Board of California's website at almonds.org/trends to learn more about almonds, the ingredient people trust. And to find out more about how to turn complex supply chain challenges into competitive advantage, visit RTI International at rti.org/food-innovation.
And that concludes this episode of Omnivore Presents SciDish. Thanks again to our guests for another amazing discussion. SciDish is produced by the Institute of Food Technologists and the editors of Food Technology magazine. To learn more about IFT and how we convene global food system professionals to advance the science of food, visit ift.org. If you're not already a member, head to ift.org/membership to find your place in the IFT community. For more insights, ideas, and innovation, check out our sister podcast, Omnivore, on the News and Publications page of ift.org. Join us again next month for another timely discussion. This is Omnivore Presents SciDish.